Welcome to Frontline Dispatches on Organizing Upgrade, a show dedicated to spotlighting the most urgent left organizing and activism happening around the country and beyond for racial and economic justice. Stay tuned for future episodes every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and 4 p.m. Pacific time. My name is Diana Robinson, and I'll be your host today. Today we will hear from Aimée-Josiane Twagirumukiza, from the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She is the Black organizing director there. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please leave comments and chats. We'll be monitoring it throughout the show. And if you haven't yet, give Organizing Upgrade a like on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And finally, to stay up to speed with all the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade, sign up at our website to hear about upcoming events, videos, articles about left strategy and for organizers. Okay, let's get into it. So welcome, Aimée. It's the last week of Black History Month, and this month we wanted to really focus the show on Black history and really uplifting the struggles of Black people and of Black liberation. We know this pandemic has disproportionately affected Black Americans, immigrants, and workers at a higher rate. And domestic work itself was founded on racial and class hierarchy, and it exploits people for their labor and love. So domestic work often conjures a specific narrative and image. In movies and popular culture, we are often presented with the Black or immigrant or Latina woman who is loving and caring. This was popular in films such as Roma and The Help. But oftentimes it seems like a foreign concept, domestic work. That's something you see in other countries, but we don't think about domestic work, or often I feel like in some communities about domestic work and how it's a real thing here in the US and how that work continues. And how these workers continue to be invisible to us, although they play such a large role in our communities. So to start us off, how has the legacy of racism impacted the conditions for domestic workers today?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I want to touch on, the stories that, you mentioned with the films The Help and Roma, both of which, did get a lot of praise and a lot of criticism. And I think that what's important about those movies, however you feel about them, is that they do visibilize Black and Indigenous domestic workers. I think the issue is that we don't have enough depictions, we don't have enough stories about Black domestic work, and we're telling their stories purely through the lens of the service that they're able to give to their employers. So I think with the work that we do at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and which is We Dream in Black, we're trying to, raise the visibility of domestic workers, but also tell a full story about how Black domestic workers in particular have been instrumental to shaping the labor movement and the civil rights movement. When I think about, movies that I would love to see or stories that I would love to be told about the domestic worker movement, I think of domestic workers like Georgia Gilmore, who was instrumental to the Montgomery bus boycott, because not only did she boycott the buses as a domestic worker and walk to work, but she also used her skills as a domestic worker to fundraise for the movement and to bring people together. And I think that it's important, and part of our work is really to also, as much as we want to transform what the labor of domestic workers, means and looks like now, we also want to get the history to reflect like a fuller picture of who Black domestic workers are and how important they've been to not just the labor movement, but to just Black liberation altogether.
Yeah, Aimée, thank you so much for that perspective and kind of framing it that way. A personal connection to domestic work, like my My mother, she immigrated to the United States in the 1980s, and her first job was as a live-in nanny for a family. So it's something that is important to me, and it often is the introduction to work for a lot of people who are immigrating into this country, especially women. And I know I heard from her some of the struggles that she faced, whether it was not being paid on time or things being deducted because she was a live-in nanny. Can you tell me about, maybe a little bit about your own personal journey, how you got into this work, but also kind of what are the major challenges that domestic workers are facing?
Yeah, so I have a similar story to yours, Diana. I'm an immigrant. I came to the US just over 20 years ago, and my mother was able to support us by becoming a domestic worker, and she became a CNA and supported us for several years, a family of 7 in total. So I do think that you're correct that domestic work is work that does enable a lot of immigrants to come in to the labor force and support their families, but it also is just a highly exploited workforce. And part of that is because of the history, right? Like Black domestic workers used to fight for citizenship, and what they meant by their fight for citizenship was that they wanted like the full suite of benefits that all other workers got. And I think today we're fighting for citizenship still, but we're also literally fighting for citizenship because immigrant domestic workers have been so central to the care industry, and the pandemic right now is only highlighting everything that we already knew was wrong, because this industry was founded on a really dehumanizing idea about who domestic workers and care workers are. So, right now we're even before the pandemic started, domestic workers, lack protections. There's a history of Black workers being, excluded from labor protections, and we still see the remnants of that in domestic work and in farm work. So we were already dealing with that. In addition to that, there's often, rampant wage theft as well as low wages. So to give you an idea, Black domestic workers on average make about $12 an hour, but we know that the take home is even less than that because people's wages are stolen. People's hours are manipulated by, misclassifying them and having unfair labor agreements. So, and it makes it even harder because there is a section of the domestic work industry that's commercialized, and can be, represented and organized in that way. But there's so many other domestic workers who are, the only employee in their employer's household. And so that presents, presents a different fight for what's going on.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about this kind of the history of domestic work and also the history of exclusion of domestic workers, and how it was incentivized. It was racial, right? Like domestic workers and farm workers were excluded from the National Labor Relations Act in the 1930s to get Southern support. And so the majority of those workers at that time were Black, and they were excluded. But we've seen a change in the types of workers doing this work. We talked about our personal journeys and our families' journeys in terms of being immigrants and doing domestic work. Can you talk a little bit about the change in who's doing domestic work, but how the legacy of domestic work continues to be exploitative, but also kind of what work is happening at building kind of solidarity and overcoming divisions that may exist between newer immigrants with the current community? Kind of how do we overcome some of those divisions that exist, and what kind of solidarity, education, and multiracial organizing is happening?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing back to our stories. And I think in a lot of ways, you know, my story, really, I should say my mother's story, could have happened, you know, in the 1930s, and it could have happened in the 1980s when, you know, when there was an influx of you know, immigrants coming into the US, because something that did really transform our movement was the invention of the home care industry. You know, that really was moving care from happening inside the home to happening inside of community-based facilities. And so that's where, you know, your nursing homes and institutions like that, you know, come from. And so when that was happening, Black women found themselves moving more into that commercial home care industry. And now, you know, Black women make up almost a third of all workers there. So we see that, and that's been happening, you know, over 50 odd some years. And so that left a gap in household work, which got filled with immigrants, with, you know, immigrant workers, both Black and non-Black immigrant workers. But that also kind of changed the shape of the domestic worker movement, to where, you know, when we look at our movement, you know, starting in the 1880s with, you know, like formerly enslaved Black women going on strike, from that point, you know, for a century, we see the domestic worker movement being led and centered on Black women. As Black women move more into commercial work, then we started to see that density change with who's actually working inside of households. But like you mentioned, Diana, the legacy still exists. And so how we frame the history and why we say it's important for any domestic worker, whether or not you're Black, to be invested in what happens to domestic workers, is because what happened to Black domestic workers is because what happened to Black domestic workers centuries ago has an effect on you today. And so we have to make that connection, and we also have to recognize that the divisions that are spouted around like immigrant labor and Black people's labor are not just divisive in terms of, you know, dividing us as an economic class of workers who can struggle together. But it also ignores the fact that there are millions of Black immigrants in this country who, and their lives don't, you know, squarely fit, you know, just in one narrative or in one mission to, you know, undo racial capitalism or, you know, fight against anti-immigrant sentiments. So, yeah, and one other thing I will say is that a struggle that did happen in the past, you know, I think we can learn a lot from our history, is that there was a moment where the national domestic worker movement was multiracial, and I think that, you know, part of why We Dream in Black was started at the National Domestic Workers Alliance is because we saw that there was an absence, that over time, less and less Black domestic worker organizations were surviving and actually remaining active and being part of that movement. And so that's what our work is really to work with you know, the wider Black community, with Black immigrants, working with Black labor groups to make sure that, you know, everybody who has a domestic worker in their family like knows and understands that, you know, this is not work that should be stigmatized, and it's work that is real work, it's valued work, and there are ways to organize for power, you know, outside of traditional labor movement.
Thanks, Aimée. I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, to post them in the comments or in the chat. We'll be happy to take questions. So feel free to do that. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout the show. So you talked about, a little bit about the history of why these chapters exist of We Dream in Black. Can you talk a little bit more about like the decision and the importance of kind of having centers or chapters that's particularly focused on Black domestic workers?
Yeah, I think it's important in the in social justice movements, regardless, for Black folks and Indigenous folks in particular to have our own spaces, to determine how we are moving in the struggle, and also to check in on each other. So I think one of the most important things about building spaces like We Dream in Black and other Black spaces, such as Black worker centers, and things like that, are to provide Black workers with a kinship space within this movement. So that's primarily what it is, and our organizing reflects that, because we do focus a lot on relationship building, but we also recognize that without the nature of white supremacy is that if we don't actively and explicitly push for Black workers and Black domestic workers to be centered, they won't be that way. And we also recognize that there is a lot of leadership that is being untapped. And we can see that with what's happened in Georgia, where domestic workers have been doing voter registration since 2015. And so we see what happens when we tap into domestic workers, power and potential, and that's what drives our work. And then we also know that domestic workers are visionaries. We have so many visionaries to pull from in history, but also today. And so something that we've contributed to the movement as We Dream in Black and as a National Domestic Workers Alliance is an unbossed agenda. And this agenda is essentially our roadmap for how we organize for labor and racial justice between now and 2025. So over the next 5 years, it's our directive. It represents the goals that we share across the country that domestic workers source and pull together. And so we are going to be following the leadership of Black domestic workers and focusing explicitly on transforming the domestic work industry by winning stronger laws and protections, really making sure that resources that are being doled out, especially now with when we're all kind of waiting to see what happens with federal relief and the response to the pandemic. So we're pushing for that. We're pushing for infrastructure to be addressed because domestic workers are not just workers. There are heads of households. 80% of Black women are heads of households. So if domestic workers are doing okay, then we're assuming that when Black domestic workers are doing okay, then all Black women are doing okay, and by default, all working people are doing okay. And then domestic workers also want to disrupt harm. So addressing what's happening right now with immigration, and particularly the ways that immigrant domestic workers, and especially undocumented immigrant domestic workers, are being impacted or even being excluded from the conversation about how do we create relief that supports all the households in this country. So our work is really just like finding the genius that lives in Black domestic workers and bringing that out and using that to, determine our way forward.
Yeah, thanks for sharing about that unbossed agenda, right? It's such a powerful name, also unbossed, like,
yes, Shirley Chisholm.
So also, just thinking more about domestic work in general, and kind of, you're talking about a vision for 2025. So what is that dream? Like, what would be like the ideal, the hope, the dream for domestic workers? Like, what is that?
Yes, I love it. So we talked a lot about, what is the world that we envisioned, and we chose the name Unboss because it really feels like we're, breaking out of the shackles of slavery. Really, right now we're experiencing domestic work as the remnants of a system of slavery and forced labor. But what we're going through and what Unbossed, really means to us is breaking out of that and having a scenario where domestic work is synonymous with, where domestic workers are synonymous with, community leaders. They're synonymous with, caregivers. They're synonymous with, idea makers, and really, making sure that this work is just dignified and respected, and that, again, like, people have those full citizenship rights, right? Like little c citizenship, but also capital C citizenship, like actually making sure that people are protected by, that there's protection, that we see citizenship as, getting our full rights of benefits that all workers deserve, and also literally as, a way for domestic workers to be protected and have access to rights through literal citizenship in this country.
Yeah, that's so important when you talk about citizenship, but also around the dignity of work, right? It's such hard work, and it involves not only physical labor many times, but also emotional labor. Just, I know from my mother's own experience, like, you build these strong relationships with the people you're caring for, and oftentimes they become part of your network, part of your family. I know the woman that my mom used to care for over 20 years, Miss Pruitt, like, she was like a second grandmother to me, and like still, like, she calls and like we talk. So it's, it's like a fabric of our lives, and such an important part of our lives, but oftentimes it's overlooked work, right? It's low paid work. And it's often seen as work for people who lack skills or are seen as uneducated. But it's such important work. So, like, what do we do I want to remind folks, if you want to ask any questions, feel free to ask questions in the chat and the comments, and we'll ask them. We still have a few more minutes, so we're happy to take questions. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and ask another question. So how do we shift that narrative? How do we add value? People see in the movies and they resonate with like these characters and they feel for them, but then it stops there. So like, what is it that we do to shift this narrative and for people to see value in this work, and that it is dignified work?
Yeah, I mean, shout that from the rooftops. It is dignified work, and it is work that, so I'll put it this way. One day I expect to take care of my parents as they age. And I would love to have the flexibility to give them care myself. But if I'm not able to do that, then I know that the value, I wouldn't be able to do that if I had to work, right? So like, I'm giving my time elsewhere, and that's why I cannot give my time here. And so I'm recognizing that, if I can't do this because of work, then this must be work. And I'm also recognizing that there's a value to the time that somebody spends with, my loved one. And so oftentimes for folks who are hiring domestic workers, it's like, how much is that care worth? How much is it worth for your home to be safe and well for you to be in? How much is it worth for your loved one to be cared for, and to be cared for by somebody who has the full capacity to give them that, physical and emotional care, because they themselves are being cared for. And I think that for the most part, people do want to honor and value the labor of folks that they hire. And however, we do need to change the narrative, and then also enforce the right decisions through our work on the ground. And so NDWA and a lot of our sister organizations have, throughout the pandemic, even put out a lot of guidelines of this is what is acceptable. This is how to make sure that you're protecting, your household, but also protecting the person who is coming into your household to take care of your loved ones. So, and I think right now we're just really wanting to make sure that people understand two central things as we talk about the aftermath, or really the continuing response to the pandemic. And it's just that we need resources. So we're fighting to make sure that any resources that, are coming, at play for workers are also reaching domestic workers, and that they're reaching, immigrant domestic workers and domestic workers who work in private homes, especially as well. And I see that there's a link to the research being shared here. So that's great. You could definitely check out the research that we've done with Black immigrant domestic workers in Massachusetts, Florida, and New York, and learn a bit about how, what the lay of the land is, and how we plan to respond to this crisis.
Yeah. Thank you, Aimée, so much for joining us today and sharing with us, what Black domestic workers are doing, domestic workers in general, kind of how they're fighting back and kind of shifting these power dynamics, right? Being able to have a say in their workplace and say the conditions that they're going to work under is so important. So thank you to all of you for joining us as well. Again, join us next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Pacific for our next episode. You can always, thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Aimée, and we are very happy to have had her to share, have them to share their perspective on what's happening with domestic workers, and to honor Black History Month as we close out the month. Thank you, and have a good night.